June 23, 2024. The wilderness of northwestern Montana, approximately 40 miles from the nearest town. Alex Morrison, a 32-year-old content creator who specialized in documenting remote wilderness areas for his YouTube channel, was flying his drone over a section of national forest that appeared on maps as completely uninhabited. Alex had been working on a documentary series about Montana's most isolated landscapes, using advanced drone technology to capture footage of areas that few people ever visited. This particular location, a densely forested valley surrounded by steep ridges, had caught his attention because of its extreme remoteness and the complete absence of any trails, roads, or structures visible on satellite imagery. The drone's camera swept across endless acres of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, capturing the untouched beauty of wilderness that had remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. Alex was reviewing the live feed on his controller's screen, looking for interesting geological features or wildlife that might make compelling footage. Around 2:45 p.m., something unusual appeared in the frame. A thin column of smoke, barely visible against the forested background, rising from what appeared to be the forest floor approximately 3 miles from where Alex had parked his vehicle. The smoke was too thin and controlled to be a wildfire, but there shouldn't have been anyone in this area. No campgrounds, no cabins, no reason for human presence. Alex adjusted the drone's flight path, bringing it closer to investigate. As the camera focused on the source of the smoke, he noticed something even stranger. The smoke seemed to be emerging from the ground itself, from between rocks and fallen logs that appeared to have been deliberately arranged to create natural-looking camouflage. "What the hell?" Alex muttered, increasing the drone's camera resolution and circling the area. The more he looked, the more convinced he became that this was no natural phenomenon. Someone had constructed something here, hidden it carefully, and was currently producing smoke, which meant someone was present right now. Over the next 3 days, Alex returned to the area with increasingly sophisticated equipment. He brought thermal imaging cameras that could detect heat signatures through forest canopy. He brought night vision equipment that allowed him to monitor the site after dark. And he brought camping gear, setting up a concealed observation post about half a mile from the mysterious smoke source. What Alex's equipment revealed was extraordinary. The thermal imaging showed a significant heat signature underground, far too large and consistent to be a natural hot spring or geothermal feature. The pattern suggested human habitation, with concentrated heat in what appeared to be a small underground structure and regular thermal variations that matched patterns of cooking, heating, and human activity. On the third night of surveillance, June 26th, Alex's night vision camera captured something that made his hands shake as he reviewed the footage. Around 11 p.m., when the forest was completely dark, a section of what had appeared to be natural forest floor, rocks, moss, fallen branches, had shifted aside. A human figure had emerged from the hidden opening. The person was male, appeared to be in his 60s, with a long gray beard and hair tied back. He wore clothes that looked handmade, or heavily modified, and he moved with the cautious efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. The man had carried several containers to a nearby stream, filled them with water, and returned to the underground entrance within 15 minutes. Then the camouflaged cover had closed, and the forest had returned to apparent emptiness. Alex had contacted the Flathead County Sheriff's Office the following morning, June 27th. Initially skeptical, the deputies had become very interested when Alex showed them the drone footage and thermal imaging data. A joint operation involving local law enforcement and FBI agents had been organized for June 29th. When officers had approached the hidden entrance and announced their presence, Demanding the occupant emerge, there had been a long silence. Then a voice, rough from disuse and struggling slightly with forming words after decades without conversation, had called out from underground. "I'm not armed. I'm coming out. Please don't shoot." The man who'd emerged, blinking in the daylight he'd apparently avoided for years, had been thin but not starving, weathered but not injured, lucid but deeply shaken. When asked to identify himself, he'd provided a name that had made the officers exchange shocked glances. "Michael Roberts," he'd said. "I've been here since 2003. A quick check of missing persons databases had revealed the impossible truth. Michael James Roberts had been reported missing on July 17, 2003, from Missoula, Montana. He'd been 42 years old at the time, married with 2 children. His truck had been found abandoned at a trailhead, and despite extensive searches, no trace of him had ever been discovered. He'd been legally declared dead in 2010, 7 years after his disappearance. 21 years. Michael Roberts had been living in a hidden underground bunker for 21 years, less than 50 miles from where he'd disappeared, while his family had grieved and rebuilt their lives believing he was dead. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in July 2003 involves a man facing impossible debts, a desperate decision that seemed like the only option, and a family destroyed by abandonment disguised as tragedy. By the end, you'll understand why Michael Roberts chose to vanish, and why discovering he was alive after 21 years was almost worse for his family than believing he was dead. The questions facing investigators were both fascinating and disturbing. How had Michael survived alone for 21 years? Why had he chosen this extreme solution rather than facing his problems? And what happens when a man returns from the dead to a family that had learned to live without him? Michael James Roberts was 42 years old in July 2003, a man whose outward life of suburban normalcy concealed mounting desperation that he'd hidden from everyone who knew him. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, with a medium build that had begun showing the softness of middle age. His light brown hair was thinning on top, and he wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the slightly studious appearance common among accountants and engineers. Michael had worked for 15 years at Henderson and Associates, a small accounting firm in Missoula, Montana, handling tax preparation and bookkeeping for local businesses and individuals. He was known as reliable, detail-oriented, and quietly competent. The kind of employee who did solid work without drama or complaint. His co-workers considered him friendly but reserved, someone who'd chat pleasantly about weather and sports, but never shared much about his personal life. To his neighbors in the modest subdivision where he'd lived since 1995, Michael had appeared to be living the American dream in miniature. A decent house with a 2-car garage, a well-maintained lawn, a reliable truck in the driveway. His wife Linda worked as a medical receptionist, and their 2 children attended Missoula public schools. They were quiet neighbors who kept to themselves, but were always polite and helpful when circumstances required interaction. But beneath this facade of normalcy, Michael had been drowning in a secret that consumed his every waking thought and invaded his dreams with anxiety that made sleep nearly impossible. Michael had been born in 1961, in Great Falls, Montana, to working-class parents who'd instilled in him the value of steady employment and financial responsibility. His father, Thomas, had worked for the railroad. His mother, Patricia, had been a school cafeteria worker. They'd provided a stable, if modest, childhood, teaching Michael that security came from hard work, saving money, and avoiding unnecessary risks. Michael had followed that blueprint faithfully for decades. He'd attended Montana State University, earned his accounting degree, found a solid job, married a woman from a similar background, bought a house, had children. He'd done everything right, built exactly the kind of life his parents had taught him to value. In 1987, at age 26, Michael had married Linda Schneider, a 24-year-old medical receptionist he'd met through mutual friends. Linda was practical, warm, and shared Michael's vision of a stable, comfortable life. Their wedding had been simple, a ceremony at Linda's family church, followed by a reception at a local restaurant, reflecting their shared belief that money should be spent wisely rather than wasted on elaborate celebrations. Their first child, Jake, had been born in 1988, a healthy boy who'd inherited his father's quiet temperament and his mother's quick smile. Michael had been nervous about fatherhood, but had settled into the role with the same methodical approach he applied to accounting. He'd read parenting books, set up college savings accounts, and made sure Jake had everything he needed, even if Michael wasn't naturally demonstrative with affection. Their daughter Emma had been born in 1991, 3 years after Jake. She'd been a more emotional, expressive child than her brother, and Michael had found himself slightly intimidated by her intensity and need for verbal reassurance. He'd loved her deeply, but had struggled to express it in ways she could understand, often showing affection through providing rather than through words or physical touch. By 2003, Jake was 15, a quiet, studious teenager who played in the school band and was already talking about studying engineering in college. Emma was 12, more outgoing than her brother, involved in school drama, and constantly surrounded by friends. Linda worked part-time at a medical clinic, managing the family's schedule and finances with efficient competence. From the outside, the Roberts family looked successful and stable. But Michael had been carrying a secret that contradicted everything he'd built, everything he'd believed about himself. The gambling had started small, almost innocently, 5 years earlier, in 1998. A co-worker had invited Michael to a friendly poker game. Just guys from work, small stakes, more about socializing than serious gambling. Michael had discovered he had a natural aptitude for calculating odds and reading opponents. He'd won consistently in those early games, and the combination of intellectual challenge and financial reward had been intoxicating. From weekly poker games, Michael had progressed to occasional visits to the casinos on the Flathead Indian Reservation, about an hour north of Missoula. The trips had been infrequent at first, maybe once every few months, telling Linda he was going fishing or attending work events. He'd won more often than he'd lost, or at least that's what he'd told himself, conveniently forgetting the losses while remembering the wins. By 2000, Michael's casino visits had become weekly, then twice weekly. He'd discovered online gambling sites that allowed him to play from home, logging on after Linda and the children went to sleep. The convenience had been dangerous. No travel time, no witnesses, no physical limit on how long he could play. What Michael hadn't fully understood, or had chosen not to acknowledge, was that his early success had been statistical anomaly rather than skill. The house always had the edge, and over time, that edge inevitably ground down even skilled players. By 2001, Michael was losing more than he was winning. By 2002, he was chasing losses, convinced that his next big win would recover everything. He'd started borrowing money to cover his losses, first from credit cards, taking cash advances that he'd intended to pay back immediately after his next win. Then from payday loan operations that charged usurious interest rates. When those sources had been exhausted, he'd turned to less legitimate lenders, loan sharks connected to organized crime who operated in the gray areas of Montana's casino economy. By July 2003, Michael owed approximately $180,000, $40,000 on credit cards that Linda didn't know about, cards he'd hidden and statements he'd intercepted before she could see them. $30,000 from payday loans and title loans against vehicles Linda didn't know he'd purchased and immediately lost, and $110,000 to 3 different criminal loan operations that had made increasingly explicit threats about what would happen if he didn't pay. Michael had been living in constant terror for months. Every phone call might be a creditor. Every knock on the door might be someone coming to make good on the threats. He'd lost weight, developed insomnia, and started having panic attacks that he'd hidden from Linda by claiming they were indigestion or work stress. The worst part was knowing that his family had no idea. Linda managed their household finances and knew about their mortgage, their car payments, their normal expenses. But Michael had handled the tax returns and other financial paperwork, giving him opportunities to hide his secret debts. He'd been systematically deceiving the person who trusted him most, and the guilt compounded his terror. Michael had considered various solutions, each more desperate than the last. He'd thought about confessing to Linda, but the shame had been paralyzing. He'd thought about bankruptcy, but that wouldn't eliminate his debts to criminal operations who didn't care about legal proceedings. He'd thought about going to police, but feared prosecution for fraud, and feared even more what the loan sharks might do in retaliation. In his darkest moments, Michael had thought about suicide, but the life insurance policy had an exclusion for suicide within 2 years, and if he killed himself, his family would get nothing and would still face his creditors trying to collect from his estate. Then, in May 2003, Michael had begun considering a different option. What if he simply disappeared? What if everyone believed he'd died in some accident without a body to prove suicide? The life insurance would pay out after he was declared legally dead. His creditors couldn't collect from a dead man. Linda and the children would be free of his debts and could build new lives without the burden of his failures. Over 2 months, Michael had planned his disappearance with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd applied to his accounting work. He'd researched survival techniques, studied maps of remote areas, and identified a location that was accessible but isolated enough that he could remain hidden indefinitely if necessary. Michael had financed his escape plan using the last available credit on his hidden cards and cash advances that pushed his total debt even higher, a final act of fraud that he'd rationalized as necessary for his family's ultimate benefit. The lumber, tools, basic supplies, and small solar panel he'd purchased in May and early June 2003 had cost approximately $8,000, money he'd borrowed, knowing he'd never repay it. In early June 2003, Michael had taken a week of vacation time and told Linda he was going on a fishing trip with co-workers, a lie she'd had no reason to question. Instead, he'd driven to the remote location he'd identified and spent 5 days constructing a crude underground shelter, stocking it with the supplies he'd purchased with borrowed money he'd never intended to repay. The bunker had been primitive, but functional, a hole approximately 8 feet by 12 feet, dug into the side of a small ridge and reinforced with salvaged lumber. He'd covered it with logs, rocks, and forest debris to make it invisible from above. He'd installed a small ventilation pipe camouflaged to look like a natural gap between rocks. He'd created a hidden entrance that could be opened from inside but appeared to be solid ground when closed. July 15, 2003, would be the day Michael Roberts executed his plan. The last day he would spend with his family, though they wouldn't know it until he failed to return. The beginning of 21 years of isolation that he'd convinced himself was his only option. Tuesday, July 15th, 2003. Missoula, Montana, had awakened too. A beautiful summer morning. Temperature in the low 70s, clear blue skies. The kind of perfect weather that made people remember why they'd chosen to live in Montana, despite its harsh winters. Michael had risen at his usual time of 6:30 a.m., though he'd barely slept. He'd spent most of the night lying awake beside Linda, memorizing the sound of her breathing, trying to convince himself that what he was about to do was the right choice, the only choice, even as doubt gnawed at him. He'd dressed quietly, jeans, a flannel shirt, hiking boots, summer fishing attire that Linda would find completely normal. He'd stood in the bedroom doorway for a long moment, watching Linda sleep, wanting to memorize this image because some part of him understood that everything was about to change irrevocably. Downstairs, Michael had made coffee and forced himself to eat toast, even though his stomach was twisted with anxiety. The normalcy of the routine, the familiar kitchen, the morning light. Through the windows, the sound of the refrigerator humming, all of it felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life rather than living his own final morning in this house. Jake had come downstairs around 7, still half asleep, headed for the cereal cupboard. At 15, he was already nearly as tall as Michael, with the awkward grace of a teenager still growing into his height. "Morning," Jake had mumbled, pouring cereal into a bowl. "Morning, buddy," Michael had replied, his voice catching slightly on the casual endearment. "You have a good day at summer school." "It's math enrichment, Dad, not summer school," Jake had corrected, with mild teenage exasperation. "And it's only half day, so I'll be home this afternoon." Michael had nodded, not trusting himself to speak more without his voice breaking. He'd wanted to say something meaningful, something that would matter when Jake looked back on this conversation years later. But what could he say without revealing his intentions? Emma had appeared around 7:15, more energetic than her brother, already chattering about her plans for the day. At 12, she was all enthusiasm and constant motion, a stark contrast to Jake's quiet reserve. "Dad, can Melissa sleep over this weekend?" Emma had asked immediately. "Her mom said it was okay if you and Mom say yes, and we want to watch movies and make friendship bracelets, and—" "You'll have to ask your mother," Michael had interrupted gently, knowing he wouldn't be here this weekend to have an opinion. "I'm sure it'll be fine." "Where are you going fishing?" Emma had asked, noticing his outdoor clothes. "That lake up past Sealy," Michael had lied smoothly. "Supposed to be good trout fishing this time of year. I'll probably camp overnight and come back tomorrow afternoon." "Can I come next time?" Emma had asked, though she'd shown little interest in fishing before. Maybe she'd sensed something, or maybe she'd just been in a generous mood, willing to show interest in her father's hobby. "Sure, Stelina," Michael had said, using his pet name for her that he'd inherited from his Italian grandmother. "Next time?" It was a promise he'd known he would never keep, and the knowledge had sat in his chest like a physical weight. Linda had come downstairs around 7:30, already dressed for work in the business casual attire required at the medical clinic. She'd smiled at Michael, kissed his cheek in the casual gesture of long marriage, and headed for the coffee pot. "You'll be back tomorrow afternoon?" she'd asked, confirming the timeline he'd established. "Should be back by 3 or 4, Michael had said. "I'll call if I'm running late." Another lie. He wouldn't be calling. He'd be in the hidden bunker, beginning a self-imposed exile that would last over 2 decades. Linda had studied him for a moment, and Michael had felt a spike of panic, wondering if she could see through him, if somehow his guilt and fear were visible on his face. But she just smiled and said, "Bring home some fish if you catch anything decent." "I will," Michael had promised, Another lie in a morning full of them. Around 8 a.m., Michael had loaded his truck with fishing gear he had no intention of using. The rod and tackle box were props, part of the deception. His real supplies, the items he'd actually need, were already at the bunker, hidden from Linda during his fishing trip in June. His final goodbyes had been agonizing in their ordinariness. He'd hugged Jake, who'd tolerated the embrace with teenage awkwardness. He'd kissed Emma's forehead, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo. He'd kissed Linda one last time, holding her perhaps a moment longer than usual, but not long enough to seem strange. "Love you," Linda had said casually, already thinking about her workday ahead. "Love you too," Michael had replied, and those were the last words he would speak to his wife for 21 years. He'd driven away from the house at 8:15 a.m., watching it disappear in his rearview mirror, wondering if he was making the biggest mistake of his life, or if this desperate plan was truly his only option. The doubts had screamed at him to turn around, to go home, to confess everything to Linda and face whatever consequences came. But the fear of his creditors had been more immediate and overwhelming than his doubts, and so he'd kept driving. The drive to the trailhead parking area had taken about 2 hours. Michael had chosen this location carefully, remote enough to be plausible for fishing, but close enough to the area where he'd built his bunker that he could hike there and be in hiding before anyone started looking for him. He'd parked his truck at exactly 10:23 a.m., noted in a small notebook he'd brought specifically to record details he might need to remember. He'd left his fishing gear visible in the truck bed, left the keys in the ignition as if he'd expected to return momentarily. He'd taken only a small day pack containing water, a map, a compass, and a few snacks, nothing that would suggest he was planning to disappear permanently. The hike to his bunker had taken approximately 90 minutes, following no established trail but using terrain features he'd memorized during his scouting trips. By noon, Michael had reached the hidden entrance, removed the camouflage carefully, and descended into the dark hole that would be his home for the next 21 years. As he'd sealed the entrance from inside, pulling forest debris over the opening to restore its invisible appearance, Michael had allowed himself one moment of complete breakdown. He'd sat in the darkness of his underground shelter and wept, understanding on some level that he'd just killed Michael Roberts, as surely as if he'd put a gun to his head. The man who'd walked away from that parking lot would never exist again. When Michael didn't return by 4 p.m. on Wednesday, July 16th, Linda had been mildly concerned but not yet worried. He'd said 3 or 4, and Michael sometimes lost track of time when fishing was good, or if he'd decided to hike to a different spot than originally planned. By 7 p.m., with dinner getting cold and still no word, Linda's concern had grown to worry. She'd tried calling Michael's cell phone, 1993 technology that required being near cell towers, but got no answer. She'd told herself he was probably out of range, which was likely given where he'd said he was fishing. By 9 p.m., Linda had been genuinely frightened. Michael was reliable to a fault. He always called if plans changed. Even if his phone had been out of range all day, he should have been back by now, or should have found a way to call. She'd waited until 10 p.m. before calling the Flathead County Sheriff's Office to report that her husband had failed to return from a fishing trip. The dispatcher had taken the information, but explained that adults missing for less than 24 hours were usually not considered emergencies unless there were special circumstances suggesting immediate danger. "My husband is extremely reliable," Linda had insisted. "Something is wrong. He would never make us worry like this." The dispatcher had promised to send a deputy to take a full report first thing in the morning if Michael hadn't returned by then. Linda hadn't slept that night. She'd sat in the living room, watching the door, jumping at every sound, willing Michael to walk through with apologies and explanations about car trouble or getting lost or any ordinary problem that could be solved. Jake and Emma, sent to bed earlier, had crept downstairs around midnight to find their mother still awake and clearly frightened. "Dad's okay, right?" Emma had asked, her voice small and scared. "He's just late?" "I'm sure he's fine," Linda had lied, pulling her daughter close. "Probably just couldn't get to a phone to let us know his plans changed." But she hadn't believed it. And neither had Emma. Thursday morning, July 17th, Linda had called the sheriff's office again at 7 a.m. A deputy had arrived at the house by 9 to take a detailed missing person report. Linda had provided a recent photo of Michael, described what he'd been wearing, given the approximate location where he'd said he'd be fishing, described his truck and license plate. By noon Thursday, deputies had located Michael's truck at the trailhead parking area exactly where he'd left it 2 days earlier. The keys were in the ignition, fishing gear visible in the truck bed, no signs of struggle or violence. Michael's wallet was in the glove compartment, his cell phone under the driver's seat, where it had apparently fallen and been forgotten. The discovery of the truck had escalated the situation immediately. If Michael had been delayed by car trouble, he would have been with his truck. If he'd hiked somewhere and gotten lost or injured, he should have taken his phone and wallet. The scene suggested he'd parked, intended to return shortly, and then something had prevented him from coming back. Search and rescue operations had begun that afternoon. Teams of volunteers, deputies, and search dogs had combed the area around the trailhead, looking for any sign of Michael: footprints, clothing, equipment, anything that might indicate which direction he'd gone or what might have happened to him. The searches had continued for 2 weeks, involving dozens of volunteers and covering hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain. Helicopters had flown grid patterns over the forest. Search dogs had followed whatever scent trails they could find. Divers had searched nearby lakes and rivers. Despite these intensive efforts, no trace of Michael Roberts had been found. The investigation had then turned to Michael's personal life, looking for clues about why he might have disappeared or who might have wanted to harm him. This was when the devastating truth about Michael's secret life had begun to emerge. Investigators had examined Michael's financial records, initially looking for signs of unusual activity that might suggest foul play. What they'd discovered had shocked Linda and provided a possible explanation for Michael's disappearance that was somehow worse than believing he'd died in an accident. Michael had been carrying enormous secret debts, over $180,000 that Linda had known nothing about. Credit cards in his name only, payday loans, title loans on vehicles Linda didn't know he'd purchased, and, most disturbing, evidence of contact with loan sharks who'd been making increasingly threatening demands for repayment. Phone records showed Michael had received dozens of calls from numbers associated with known criminal operations in the months before his disappearance. Text messages recovered from his cell phone included explicit threats. "Pay what you owe, or your family finds out what kind of man you really are." "Last warning. We know where your kids go to school. You've got 1 week. After that, we're done being patient." Linda had been devastated by these revelations. The man she'd thought she knew, steady, responsible, slightly boring Michael, had been living a completely secret life of gambling and debt. He'd been lying to her for years, stealing from their family's financial security to fund his addiction, putting their children at potential risk from criminals she'd had no idea existed in their lives. The investigation's working theory had evolved to suggest that Michael had either been killed by his creditors or had chosen to disappear to escape the debts and threats. Without a body, it was impossible to determine which scenario was correct. For Linda and the children, the uncertainty had been agonizing. If Michael was dead, they could grieve and move forward. If he'd chosen to abandon them to escape his debts, that was a different kind of loss, one complicated by betrayal and anger alongside the grief. In 2010, 7 years after Michael's disappearance, Linda had petitioned the court to have Michael declared legally dead. The declaration had allowed her to access his life insurance policy, $300,000 that had helped pay off the debts Michael had hidden and provided financial security for Jake and Emma's college educations. Linda had never remarried. She'd told friends that she couldn't imagine trusting someone that completely again after learning how thoroughly Michael had deceived her. Jake and Emma had grown up marked by their father's mysterious disappearance, shaped by the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to him. None of them had imagined that Michael was alive, living in a hole in the ground less than 50 miles away, watching years pass in solitary confinement he'd imposed on himself. The 21 years between Michael's disappearance in July 2003 and his discovery in June 2024 were years of immense change for the family he'd left behind. Linda, Jake, and Emma had been forced to rebuild their lives from the wreckage of uncertainty and betrayal, each finding their own way to cope with loss, compounded by the knowledge that the man they'd grieved had been living a secret life of addiction and deceit. Linda had been 40 years old when Michael vanished, a woman who'd built her life around the assumption of partnership and shared struggle only to discover that partnership had been an illusion. The revelation of Michael's gambling addiction and enormous debts had been almost worse than his disappearance. It had poisoned her memories, making her question every moment of their marriage and wonder what else he'd lied about. The first years after Michael's disappearance had been a brutal struggle for survival. Linda's income as a medical receptionist had been sufficient for their previous lifestyle because Michael's accounting job had provided the family's primary income. Suddenly, single and effectively widowed, Linda had taken a second job doing medical billing from home at night, working 12 to 14 hours a day to keep the house and provide for Jake and Emma. The life insurance money in 2010 had eased the financial pressure but couldn't heal the emotional wounds. Linda had used it to pay off the last of Michael's hidden debts, fund college accounts for both children, and create a small emergency fund. She'd been determined that Michael's failures wouldn't destroy their children's futures. Jake had been 15 when his father disappeared, old enough to understand that something was terribly wrong, but young enough to be shaped profoundly by the loss and confusion. The revelation of his father's gambling addiction and debts had filled Jake with anger that had taken years of therapy to process. He'd felt betrayed not just by his father's disappearance, but by the discovery that the quiet, responsible man he'd known had been a facade hiding someone Jake didn't recognize. That anger had driven Jake academically. He'd graduated high school with honors, earned a full scholarship to Montana State University, and completed an engineering degree with the same methodical precision his father had once applied to accounting. But where Michael's precision had masked anxiety and deceit, Jake's was genuine. A way of maintaining control and ensuring he would never become the kind of man his father had been. By 2024, Jake was 36 years old, a successful civil engineer in Seattle, Washington. He'd married at 28, divorced at 32, the relationship foundering on his difficulty with trust and vulnerability. He'd remained close to his mother and sister, but maintained careful emotional distance from most other relationships, protecting himself from the kind of betrayal his father had demonstrated. Emma had been 12 when Michael vanished, young enough that her memories of her father were filtered through the idealization common to pre-adolescence. She'd remembered the bedtime stories, the pet name, Stelina, the rare moments when Michael had seemed relaxed and present. The revelation of his secret life had been confusing and painful in ways she'd struggled to articulate even years later. Emma had dealt with her father's disappearance through artistic expression, developing a talent for painting that had helped her process emotions too complex for words. She'd attended the University of Montana on an art scholarship, eventually earning an MFA and establishing herself as a professional artist whose work often explored themes of absence, loss, and fractured family relationships. By 2024, Emma was 33, living in Bozeman, Montana, and teaching art at the university while maintaining her own studio practice. She'd never married, though she'd had several long-term relationships that had ended when her partners wanted commitments she'd found herself unable to make. Therapy had helped her understand that her father's abandonment had left her with deep trust issues and fear of depending on anyone completely. The mystery of Michael's fate had haunted all three family members differently. Linda had eventually come to believe Michael was dead, probably killed by the loan sharks whose threats had filled his phone records. The alternative, that he'd chosen to abandon them, was too painful to accept, and belief in his death allowed her a form of closure. Jake had oscillated between believing his father was dead and believing he'd run away to start a new life somewhere, free of his debts and the family he'd viewed as a burden. In his darker moments, Jake had admitted to his therapist that part of him hoped his father had suffered, had gotten what he deserved for the pain he'd caused. Emma had held on to hope longer than her mother or brother, wanting to believe that Michael had died quickly in some accident, rather than having chosen to leave them. She'd developed an elaborate fantasy that he'd been trying to protect them, that somehow his disappearance had been a sacrifice, rather than abandonment. Her therapist had gently suggested this fantasy was a protective mechanism, a way of maintaining love for a father who didn't deserve it. Alex Morrison had been fascinated by remote wilderness areas since childhood, when his family's camping trips to Montana's national forests had instilled in him a love for landscape, photography, and documentation. By 2024, at age 32, he'd built a moderately successful YouTube channel called Forgotten Wilderness, producing documentary-style videos about areas that appeared completely unchanged by human presence. His equipment had evolved significantly over the years. What had started with a basic DSLR camera had expanded to include professional video equipment, several high-end drones equipped with both standard and thermal imaging cameras, and various other technologies that allowed him to capture and document remote areas in unprecedented detail. In June 2024, Alex had been working on a series about Montana's most isolated valleys, areas that were accessible but so remote that few people visited them. The valley where he'd detected the unusual smoke had been perfect for his purposes, nearly 40 miles from the nearest town. No established trails, dense forest coverage that had remained essentially untouched for centuries. The initial discovery of smoke rising from the forest floor on June 23rd had puzzled Alex. His first assumption had been that someone was camping illegally in the national forest. But the smoke's consistency and the careful camouflage of its source had suggested something more deliberate than a temporary campsite. The thermal imaging data he'd collected on June 24th had been even more intriguing. The heat signature underground showed patterns that were distinctly human, concentrated, areas suggesting a heating source, regular variations that matched cooking cycles, and a size and configuration that suggested a small underground structure rather than a natural cave. What had truly shocked Alex had been the night vision footage from June 26th. Watching a human being emerge from what had appeared to be solid forest floor, perform a brief task, and disappear back underground had been surreal. The figure's cautious movements and obvious familiarity with the routine had suggested this wasn't a recent development. Whoever this was had been here long enough to establish patterns and procedures. Alex had wrestled with what to do with his discovery. Part of him had wanted to respect the person's obvious desire for solitude and privacy. But the location was on federal land, and whoever was living here was doing so illegally. More importantly, Alex had no way of knowing if this person was in danger, suffering from mental illness, or perhaps even a fugitive from justice. He'd contacted the Flathead County Sheriff's Office on June 27th, expecting skepticism, but bringing enough evidence, drone footage, thermal imaging data, GPS coordinates, that deputies had taken his report seriously. The operation to investigate had been organized quickly, with FBI involvement because of the federal land issue and the possibility they might be dealing with a fugitive. On June 29th, at approximately 10 a.m., law enforcement had approached the hidden bunker entrance. Sheriff's Deputy James Foster had called out, "This is the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. We know you're in there. Come out slowly with your hands visible. We're not here to hurt you, but you need to come out and identify yourself." There had been a long silence. Then, from underground, a voice that sounded rough from disuse and struggled with forming words after so long without human conversation. "I'm not armed. I'm coming out. Please don't shoot." The camouflaged entrance, an ingenious construction of hinged boards covered with moss, rocks, and forest debris, had slowly opened. The man who'd emerged had been thin but not emaciated, missing several teeth from years without dental care, his remaining teeth yellowed and damaged. His beard and hair were long and gray, his skin weathered, and lined far beyond his 63 years from limited sun exposure and the harsh conditions of his existence. He'd worn clothes that appeared to be a mixture of heavily modified, store-bought items and pieces he'd clearly made himself from animal hides and plant fibers. "I need you to identify yourself," Deputy Foster had said, his weapon drawn but pointed at the ground in a non-threatening position. "Michael Roberts," the man had said, squinting in the daylight. "I've been here since 2003. The name had meant nothing to Deputy Foster, but his partner, Deputy Maria Santos, had felt recognition click into place. "Michael Roberts, from Missoula, the accountant. Who disappeared?" Michael had nodded slowly. "That's me. I didn't think anyone would remember after all this time." The initial interview at the scene had revealed the basic facts. Michael had built the bunker before his disappearance, stocked it with basic supplies, and lived there in isolation for 21 years. He'd survived through a combination of foraging, hunting small game with snares, fishing in nearby streams, and carefully rationed supplies he'd occasionally supplemented through nighttime raids on remote cabins and camps when desperation demanded. The bunker itself had been a crude but functional structure. The main living space was approximately 8 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling height of just over 6 feet. Michael had insulated it with layers of foam and plastic sheeting scavenged from various sources. A small wood stove provided heat and cooking capability, with a carefully concealed ventilation pipe that released smoke through a camouflaged opening among rocks. Inside, investigators had found evidence of 21 years of solitary existence. Shelves made from scavenged lumber held supplies, canned goods that Michael had carefully rationed, tools he'd maintained and improvised, books he'd read dozens of times. A calendar scratched into the wall showed Michael had kept meticulous track of days, though he'd later admitted the isolation had sometimes made it difficult to maintain accurate count. Michael had created systems for everything. Water, collection from a nearby stream, purified through a filter he'd constructed from sand, gravel, and charcoal. A small solar panel scavenged from an abandoned cabin, providing just enough electricity for a reading light. Food preservation through smoking and drying. Clothing maintenance and creation from animal hides and scavenged fabrics. What the bunker lacked was any real comfort or pleasure beyond survival. There were no decorations, no photographs, nothing that connected Michael to his former life or suggested he'd tried to create a home rather than simply a hiding place. The space felt more like a prison cell than a dwelling, which perhaps reflected Michael's psychological state during those 21 years. The news that Michael Roberts had been found alive after 21 years sent shockwaves through Missoula and beyond. The case that had been presumed closed, another missing person who'd probably died in the wilderness, had suddenly become something far more complicated and disturbing. For Michael's family, the news was devastating in ways that discovering remains would never have been. The phone call Linda received on June 29, 2024, from the Flathead County Sheriff's Office was one she'd never imagined possible. "Mrs. Roberts, this is Deputy James Foster. I'm calling because we've found your husband Michael. He's alive." Linda had actually laughed, thinking this was a cruel prank or some kind of scam. "That's impossible. My husband has been dead for 21 years. Ma'am, I understand this is shocking, but I'm looking at him right now. He's identified himself as Michael James Roberts, and we've confirmed his identity through fingerprints. He's been living in a hidden bunker in the National Forest since 2003. The rest of the conversation had blurred into incoherence as Linda's mind struggled to process the impossible. Michael was alive. He'd been alive this whole time, which meant he'd chosen to leave them, chosen to let them believe he was dead, chosen 21 years of solitary existence over facing his problems and his family. Jake had been at work in Seattle when his mother called. His first response had been fury, so pure and overwhelming that he'd had to leave the office and walk for 2 hours before he could trust himself to speak coherently about what he'd learned. Emma had been teaching a class when she'd received her mother's text. "Dad is alive. Call me immediately." She'd dismissed her. Students early and sat in her studio, staring at that message for 30 minutes before she could make herself believe it was real. Michael had been transported to Missoula and placed in custody, while authorities determined what charges, if any, should be filed against him. He'd violated no criminal laws by disappearing. Adults have the legal right to vanish if they choose. But the insurance fraud aspect was more complicated. Linda had collected $300,000 in life insurance, benefits based on Michael being declared dead. That money would likely need to be returned, and Michael could potentially face fraud charges. The more pressing question was whether Michael had any legal or moral obligation to the family he'd abandoned. He'd been declared legally dead, which had dissolved his marriage and ended his parental rights. In the eyes of the law, the Michael Roberts who'd disappeared in 2003 no longer existed. The man who'd emerged from the bunker was, in some technical sense, a different person. Linda had refused to see Michael initially. The thought of being in the same room with the man who'd let her grieve for 21 years, who'd let their children grow up believing he was dead, was more than she could bear. But after several days and conversations with a therapist, she'd agreed to a supervised meeting at the county jail where Michael was being held. The meeting had been brief and painful. Michael had looked older than his 63 years, thin and weathered, his eyes unable to hold Linda's gaze for more than a few seconds at a time. "Why?" Linda had asked, the only question that really mattered. "Why did you do this to us?" Michael had tried to explain. The debts, the threats, the belief that his family would be better off if he was dead, and the insurance paid out. Linda had listened in stunned silence as Michael described his reasoning, his planning, his 21 years of isolation. "You let me believe you were dead," Linda had said when he'd finished, her voice shaking. "You let Jake and Emma grow up without a father. You destroyed our family to escape gambling debts that would have been forgiven after 7 years. You threw away everything we built together because you were too much of a coward to face what you'd done." "I thought I was protecting you," Michael had replied weakly. "You were protecting yourself," Linda had corrected. "You were taking the coward's way out, just like you always did. Instead of facing your problems, instead of trusting me enough to ask for help, you just disappeared and left us to clean up your mess." Linda had left after 20 minutes, telling Michael she never wanted to see him again. The legal dissolution of their marriage had been final. They were no longer husband and wife. She owed him nothing, and she intended to maintain that separation. Jake had refused to meet with Michael at all. When contacted by authorities, he'd said simply, "The man I called father died in 2003. Whoever is in that cell, it's not my father, and I have no interest in meeting a stranger." Emma had been the only family member willing to give Michael more than one brief meeting. She'd visited him 3 times over 2 weeks, trying to understand how the father she'd remembered, the man who'd called her Stelina and told her bedtime stories, could have become someone capable of such abandonment. The conversations had been difficult and ultimately unsatisfying. Michael had struggled to articulate his reasoning in ways that made sense even to himself. 21 years of isolation had done something to his mind, making it difficult for him to fully connect with the emotions he'd felt in 2003 or to understand the impact his choices had had on his family. "I thought about you every day," Michael had told Emma during their final meeting. "I thought about coming back hundreds of times, but the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to imagine how I could possibly explain or justify what I'd done." "So you just gave up?" Emma had asked. "You just decided it was easier to stay hidden forever than to face us?" Michael had nodded miserably. "I know it doesn't make sense. I know I destroyed everything. But yes, that's exactly what I did." Emma had left that meeting in tears, telling the guards she wouldn't be back. She'd given him 3 chances to provide an explanation that might allow for understanding or forgiveness, and he'd failed all. 3 times. Whatever relationship they might have salvaged had been impossible. The gulf between them was simply too vast. The legal resolution of Michael's case had been complex. The insurance company had sued to recover the $300,000 paid to Linda, arguing that Michael's deliberate disappearance constituted fraud. Linda had settled by agreeing to repay $200,000, keeping $100,000 that she'd already spent on paying Michael's debts and funding the children's educations. Prosecutors had ultimately declined to file criminal charges against Michael, determining that while his actions had been reprehensible, they didn't clearly violate any specific statutes. He'd defrauded an insurance company, but the civil lawsuit addressed that harm. He'd abandoned his family, but that wasn't a crime. Michael had been released from custody after 6 weeks, a free man legally but completely untethered from any normal life. He had no home, no job, no relationships, no skills relevant to the 21st century he'd been absent from for over 2 decades. The world had changed dramatically since 2003, Smartphones, social media, the entire digital infrastructure of modern life were foreign to someone who'd been living in a hole in the ground. A local organization that worked with homeless individuals had helped Michael find housing in a group facility and connected him with resources for people trying to reintegrate into society after long absences. But Michael had struggled profoundly with the transition. After 21 years of isolation and the rigid routine of survival, the complexity and social demands of normal life had been overwhelming. Medical examinations had revealed the physical toll of his isolation, severe dental disease requiring multiple extractions, vitamin D deficiency that had weakened his bones, and chronic pain from years of sleeping on hard ground. His speech improved with practice, but he continued to struggle with complex conversations and often fell silent mid-sentence, unable to find words that had once come easily. By December 2024, 6 months after his discovery, Michael was living in a small efficiency apartment subsidized by social services, working part-time doing basic data entry for a company that specifically hired people with difficult backgrounds. He attended weekly therapy sessions that focused on his gambling addiction, which he'd never actually addressed, just physically separated himself from, and his profound isolation and inability to form normal human connections. He had no contact with Linda, Jake, or Emma. They'd made clear they wanted nothing to do with him, and Michael had respected that boundary as the minimum decency he could offer after everything he'd done. Sometimes he thought about writing them letters, trying to explain, but he'd recognized that would be selfish, an attempt to ease his own guilt rather than considering what they might need or want. The story of Michael Roberts served as a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of gambling addiction and the lies addicts tell themselves about protecting loved ones while actually protecting only themselves from consequences. His 21 years in a bunker had been a form of suicide without death, a way of erasing himself while still technically existing. For his family, Michael's reappearance after 21 years was in many ways worse than if he'd actually died. It had reopened wounds that had slowly healed, forced them to confront that their grief had been based on a lie, and deprived them of even the comfort of believing Michael had loved them enough to have not chosen to abandon them. Michael himself seemed to recognize that his 21 years of isolation had been for nothing. The debts he'd been running from would have been discharged after 7 years. The threats from loan sharks would have ended when they'd realized he had nothing to take. If he'd simply faced his problems, confessed to Linda, declared bankruptcy, and dealt with the consequences, he'd have had 14 years to rebuild his life and his family, rather than wasting 2 decades in a hole in the ground. But recognizing the mistake and living with its consequences were 2 different things. Michael had traded his family, his identity, and 21 years of his life for the temporary relief of not having to face his failures. It was a trade he'd made impulsively in desperation, and one he would regret for whatever remained of his life. The bunker where Michael had lived for 21 years was dismantled by Forest Service workers in August 2024. They'd filled in the hole, scattered the debris, and let the forest reclaim the space. Within a few years, there would be no visible evidence that anyone had ever lived there. The ground would be just ground again, and Michael's 21 years of self-imposed exile would exist only in memory and official records. Michael Roberts had wanted to disappear, to become nothing, to escape his life completely. In that goal, he'd been entirely successful. The Michael who'd walked away from his truck in 2003 had effectively died that day. The man who'd emerged from the bunker in 2024 was someone different, someone damaged by isolation, haunted by consequences, and faced with the reality that some mistakes are too fundamental to ever be repaired.